The woman standing in the doorway of the boarding house kitchen was plain and 40 and holding a wooden spoon like it might be called into evidence. Her name was Martha Crane, and she had been cooking in that kitchen for 3 years without complaint or decoration, and the men who ate there had opinions about her cooking. The way men have opinions about weather, which is to say they mentioned it often and did nothing about it. On this particular morning in late September, a man named Samuel Holt stood in that same doorway watching her work. He was tall in the way of men who have spent their lives bending to fit under door frames built by shorter generations, and he wore work clothes that had been clean that morning. He had walked into town with a contract for timber work and a need for a cook who could feed 8 men through a winter camp, and he had been told by 3 separate people that Martha Crane was not the person he wanted. She didn't look up when he cleared his throat. She was flouring chicken pieces with the methodical attention of someone performing surgery, each piece turned twice and set aside in a line. The kitchen smelled of lard heating and coffee that had been on the stove since before dawn. "Miss Crane," he said. "Mrs.," she said, not looking up. "Mrs. Crane, my name is Samuel Holt. I'm running a timber camp 20 miles north, and I need a cook for the season. Can you feed 8 men?" She set down the last piece of chicken and wiped her hands on her apron. When she looked at him, her face showed nothing at all, which he would learn was her way of showing a great deal. "I feed 12 men every day in this kitchen," she said. "Have been for 3 years." "I heard that," he said. "I also heard the food was plain." "It is. And that you don't take suggestions." "I don't. And that you're difficult." She picked up a cast iron skillet that must have weighed 8 pounds and set it on the stove with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "I cook what keeps men working. If they want fancy, they can marry it or buy it in town. If they want to stay upright through a day's labor, they eat what I make and they don't get sick and they don't complain where I can hear them." Samuel Holt had been hiring men for 15 years, and he knew the difference between difficult and exact. "The camp pays 40 a month and found," he said. "You'd have your own cabin and no serving, just cooking and cleanup. I'd haul supplies once a week." "Who cooked for you last season?" "My brother. He's got a wife now." "And the season before that?" "A man named Perry who drank." She looked at him the way a person looks at a column of figures that don't add up. "Why me?" "Because 3 people told me not to hire you," he said, "and all 3 of them are still eating here." Something crossed her face then, too quick to name, and she turned back to the chicken. "I'll need a list of what you stock and what you don't. I'll need a decent stove and a window that opens, and I don't cook Sundays." "Sundays you rest, or Sundays the men fend for themselves?" "Sundays I cook a cold dinner Saturday night and they eat it without me." "That's agreeable," he said. She didn't say anything else, and he didn't either, and he left the way he had come. And the chicken went into the skillet the way it always did, and if anyone had asked Martha Crane what had just happened, she would have said a man offered her a job, which was true but not complete. What had happened was that Samuel Holt had listened to exactly the same complaints every other man had heard, and arrived at the opposite conclusion, and Martha Crane, who had not been looked at directly by a man in more than a decade, had felt the fact of it like a hand steadying her elbow on an icy step. She had been married once to a man who left, and she did not dwell on it the way some women dwelt on things, but it had made her careful. She took the job because 40 a month was more than she made at the boarding house, and because a winter camp meant no miners coming in drunk and no landlady standing in the kitchen doorway sighing about waste. She took it because she was tired of feeding men who did not notice food unless it was absent, and because Samuel Holt had called her difficult and then hired her anyway. The camp was a mile past where the road gave up, and the cabin he had promised her was sound and small, and contained a stove that looked like it had been built by someone who understood that a stove was a tool and not a decoration. There was a window over the dry sink, and it opened. There was a bed with a frame and a table with 2 chairs, which was one more chair than she needed, but she did not say so. The men arrived in ones and twos over the next week, and she fed them the way she fed anyone, which was without commentary. They ate beans and bacon and cornbread and fried potatoes and stew, and they ate it the way working men eat, which is fast and grateful and without much talking. Samuel Holt ate with them, but sat at the end of the table, and if he had opinions about the food, he kept them to himself. By the second week, she had learned their names and their habits. There was a young one called James, who was too thin and who she fed twice. There was an older man named Hewitt who had been a camp cook himself once and who rinsed his plate without being asked. There was a loud one named Taggart who complained about everything in a way that seemed like a form of entertainment, and the others mostly ignored him. Samuel Holt did not ignore him. On the third morning that Taggart mentioned that his mother made better biscuits, Samuel looked up from his plate and said, "Then you should winter with your mother." And the room got quiet in the way rooms do when everyone agrees with what has just been said, but nobody had been willing to say it. Taggart did not mention his mother's biscuits again. Martha Crane did not thank Samuel Holt for this, but the next morning the biscuits were an inch taller, and there were 2 extra. And when he took a second one, she refilled the gravy boat without being asked, and neither of them spoke about it, and the matter was closed. The work was hard in the way that cooking for men has always been hard, which is to say it was endless and exact and invisible when done right. She baked bread twice a week and boiled laundry on Mondays and kept the stove going every hour she was awake. Her hands cracked in the cold, and she wrapped them at night in lard and old flour sacks, and she did not complain because there was no one to complain to and because the work was hers. Samuel Holt brought supplies every Saturday, driving a wagon up a trail that barely deserved the name. He brought flour and sugar and salt pork and coffee and whatever else she had written on the list he left with her, and he never questioned the list and he never shorted her. If she wrote molasses, he brought molasses. If she wrote 2 pounds dried apples, he brought 3. The first time he did this, she mentioned it, and he said, "Margin for waste," and she said, "I don't waste," and he said, "I know," and that was the end of the conversation. He began staying for coffee after he unloaded, sitting at the table in her cabin while she made a new list. He did not talk much, but he was not uncomfortable with silence, and she learned that he had been running timber camps for 8 years, and that he had a sister in Ohio he wrote to, and that he had lost his wife to fever before there were children, and she learned this not because he told her, but because he mentioned a letter from his sister, and because he did not correct her when she called him Mr. Holt instead of Samuel, and because there was no worn place on his hand where a ring had been, but there was a carefulness in the way he spoke about women that suggested he had loved one. She did not tell him that she had been married, but one Saturday in November he saw the daguerreotype she kept on the shelf, a stiff portrait of a young woman and a young man who looked like they were sitting for a trial. And he did not ask about it, and she did not explain, but the next week he brought her a bag of dried peaches without her asking. And she made a pie, and he ate a piece standing up in the kitchen and said it was good, and that was all that was said. The winter came on hard that year, the way it did in the mountains, and the men worked shorter days and came back to the cabin, cold and hungry and mean-tempered the way cold and hungry men get. She fed them stew and biscuits and cornbread and anything that would stick to their ribs, and she kept the coffee going all day, and she did this without praise or complaint because it was the job. There was one bad week in January when the snow came so heavy that Samuel could not get through with supplies, and she stretched what she had the way a person stretches $1, and the men ate thinner meals and noticed, but did not say much because they could see she was eating thinner too. When Samuel finally came through, he took one look at the kitchen and went back to the wagon and brought in a ham he had not been asked for. And she said, "That's not on the list." And he said, "It is now." She made beans with the ham, and the men ate like they had forgotten what fullness felt like. And that night, Samuel stayed later than usual, and they sat in the kitchen while the stove ticked and cooled, and he said, "You did well." "I did what there was to do. Not every cook would have." She looked at him across the table and saw that he meant it, and something settled between them that had been hanging in the air since September, and she said, "Not every timberman would have brought a ham." And he said, "No," and they left it at that. By February, the men had stopped talking about her cooking, except to say they were hungry for it, which she understood was the closest thing to a compliment she was likely to get. They worked and ate and slept and did not get sick, and she took this as evidence that she was doing what she had been hired to do. Samuel Holt came every Saturday unless the snow was too deep, and when he could not come, he sent a man named Hewitt with a note that said what he was sending and when he would come himself, and she kept the notes in a tin on the shelf, though she could not have said why. In March, a man came up to the camp looking for work, a loud man with opinions about how things should be run, and Samuel told him there was no work, and the man said he had heard there was, and Samuel said he had heard wrong. The man looked at the camp and looked at the cabin and said, "I heard you had a woman cooking," in a way that made it sound like a question about her character, and Samuel stood up from where he had been sitting and said, "You heard right, and now you can hear your way back down the mountain." The man left, and Samuel did not mention it, but Martha had been standing in the doorway and had heard the whole thing, and that night she made dried apple cake, which she had not made all winter, and Samuel ate 2 pieces and said, "What's the occasion?" And she said, "No occasion." And he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first day in the boarding house kitchen, and he did not argue. The camp closed in April when the snow melted enough to float the timber down, and the men were paid and scattered, and Martha packed her things and cleaned the cabin the way she cleaned everything, which was thoroughly. Samuel came to collect her on the last day, and they loaded her trunk into the wagon, and she locked the cabin door and left the key on the table inside the way he had asked. They did not speak much on the drive back to town. The road was mud and ruts, and the wagon jolted, and she held onto the seat and watched the trees thin out into scrub and then into the cleared land around the valley. And she thought about the boarding house kitchen and the men who would be eating there tonight, and she felt nothing about it, which surprised her. When they reached the edge of town, Samuel stopped the wagon and turned to her and said, "I'm opening another camp in the fall. Bigger crew, longer season. I'd want you to cook. I haven't said I'm going back to the boarding house." "I know." 40 a month is good wages, but it's not a living if the work is seasonal." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I'm buying a house in town. It needs work, but it's sound. I'd want someone to keep it while I'm in camp. There'd be a room and a wage for that too, if you were willing." She understood what he was asking and what he was not asking, and she said, "I'd want to see the house." "That's fair." He drove her to a house on the south end of town, a narrow 2-story house with a porch that sagged and windows that needed glazing, and he opened the door and let her walk through it alone. It smelled like dust and old wood and mice, and the kitchen was small, but the stove was good, and there was a room off the back that got morning light, and she stood in that room and looked out at a yard that had once been a garden and thought about what it would be like to live in a house where no one was eating but her. When she came back out, he was standing in the kitchen, running his hand along the dry sink, and he said, "It's not much. It's enough. I'd pay you to keep it, and I'd pay you to cook at camp, and you'd have the house year-round if you wanted it. And if I didn't want it, then you'd say so and I'd ask someone else." She looked at him and saw that he meant that too, and she said, "I'll take it, both." He nodded and did not smile, but something in his face eased, and he said, I'll have the porch fixed before you move in." And she said, "That's not necessary." And he said, "It is." And she did not argue. She moved into the house in May, and he was right that it needed work. But the porch was sound, and the windows were glazed, and there was a cord of firewood stacked by the back door that she had not asked for. She cleaned the house room by room, and planted a garden, and learned the rhythms of a place that was hers. And when Samuel came to town, he stopped by to see if she needed anything, and she always said no, and he always checked the stove and the roof anyway, and she stopped mentioning it. In June, he asked her to marry him. He did not ask it the way men ask things in stories, with speeches or flowers or bending down. He asked it on a Tuesday evening while she was shelling peas at the kitchen table, and he was fixing a window latch that had stuck, and he said, "I'd like you to marry me if you're willing." And she said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I'd rather live in this house with you than without you, and because I think you're the finest cook I've ever hired and the only woman I've met in 10 years I wanted to sit quiet with." She looked at him and saw that he was nervous, which she had never seen him be, and she said, "I'm 43 years old and I was married before and I'm not easy. I know all that. And you still want to?" "I do." She set down the bowl of peas and wiped her hands on her apron, and she said, "Then I'm willing." And he crossed the kitchen and kissed her once carefully, like a man who had not kissed anyone in a long time and wanted to be sure he remembered how, and she let him. They were married in August by a justice of the peace with Samuel's sister and her husband as witnesses, and there was no fuss and no party. And Martha wore a gray dress she already owned, and Samuel wore a suit he had bought for the occasion. And when it was done, they went home to the house with the fixed porch and ate the dinner she had made that morning. And that night they lay in the bed in the room that got morning light and did not say much, because there was not much that needed saying. The camp opened in September, and she cooked for 12 men that season, and Samuel ran the work, and they lived the way they had been living. Except that now, when he came to the kitchen for coffee, he kissed her first, and when she made his plate, she made it fuller, and the men noticed and said nothing, because they were not fools. They lived this way for 22 years. The camps got bigger and then smaller, and Samuel's back got stiffer and Martha's hands got more crooked, and they bought a cow, and then 2 chickens, and then a dog that followed Martha everywhere and lay under the kitchen table while she cooked. They did not have children, which was a sorrow Martha carried quietly, and Samuel never mentioned, but they had the house and the work and each other, and it was enough. Samuel died on a cold morning in March, quickly and without warning, the way a man who has worked hard all his life sometimes does, and Martha buried him in the town cemetery under a stone that said his name and his years and nothing else, because he would not have wanted more. She lived in the house alone after that, and she stopped cooking for camps, but she cooked for herself, and sometimes for the neighbors' children, and sometimes for women in town who were sick or new to motherhood or alone. She cooked the way she always had, plainly and well, and people ate what she made and felt cared for in a way they could not quite name. On the morning of her 71st birthday, she was making biscuits, the same biscuits she had made 1,000 times, when she found the tin on the shelf where she kept the notes Samuel had sent during that first winter. She opened it and read them one by one, his careful handwriting listing supplies and weather, and once, at the bottom of a note from February, a single line that said, "The men say the cooking is the best they've had. I agree." She had not remembered that line, or perhaps she had and had not let herself think about it, and she stood in the kitchen holding the note and thought about the day he had hired her, and the way he had listened to people tell him she was difficult and had hired her anyway, and the way he had brought a ham through snow because she had stretched beans as far as they would go, and the way he had asked her to marry him while fixing a window latch because that was the kind of man he was. She put the note back in the tin and finished the biscuits, and she ate one with butter and jam. And it was good, and she thought that if anyone had asked her that morning in the boarding house kitchen if she would end up here, in this house, having been loved plainly and well by a man who valued her exactly as she was, she would not have believed them. But it had happened anyway, the way good things sometimes do, by accumulation, one day adding to the last,